and questions after the civic speakers. Thank you.
Buenas noches, bienvenidos a todos. Aquellos que necesitan la traducción en español, les pedimos que levanten la mano y les van a alcanzar los headsets. A ver que se vea bien alto, por favor. Y vamos a hacer una pequeña prueba de sonido. We're going to try the sound before we get started. Make sure that the interpreter and the headsets are working fine. Thank you. Les pido a todos los que tienen headset que levanten la mano en este momento y si escuchan bien el sonido, que la bajen. Si escuchan bien la traducción, que la bajen. Ok, gracias.
Wonderful. I'm not sure if this is, I'm not even sure if this is supposed to go on my ear. I feel like I'm landing a plane. Can you all hear me?
I think this one.
No? Wonderful. It's a delight being here. It was really wonderful to be here last year as well. I had hobbled in on crutches last year for those of you who were around and cared to listen to me again. I had fallen off a family-friendly waterfall and broke my knee in several places. Thankfully, everything is well. And at the same time, we had learned that we were stuck in a small mine has been keeping us busy in these good days. A few things. So look at this. How many of you were here last year's venue? Oh, excellent. I'll be using different stories this time around. I could just manually ask you that, which is really fun. Is that okay? Okay. So my apologies to the translator. I'm a French Canadian, so I'll be speaking very quickly, but I'll try to, dust myself. This is where I start with my own students and with parishioners. I think there's something interesting about the age of religious illiteracy that we find ourselves coming into. Right? That a lot of people are adherent, for instance, people observant with the faith tradition, but often don't know much about what the tradition actually teaches. In fact, when I started teaching bioethics and controversies in Catholic ethics at Emory, I remember one of my colleagues saying, Corey, how big is your textbook for that class? And I said, I don't know what you're trying to insinuate. He's like, well, clearly you just need a pamphlet that says no, right, for the Catholic perspective on all things. And I thought, that's offensive, you'll need to sit in on this class. This is very common though, by the way, right? Of people who often know perhaps the conclusions of what the church teaches, but not very much for reasoning, and I hope to break that open with you today. This is where I often start with a colleague's comments on how we do ethics, which I think will be a nice way to start up today's event. Because people don't generally engage in moral reasoning, but moral, what he calls rationalization. They begin with the conclusion, coughed up by an unconscious emotion, and then work backward to a plausible justification. And I don't know if you agree with that, but the understanding is often that we kind of regurgitate the answer to the ethics, right? Euthanasia, abortion, you name it. And then when people say, well, why is it that you believe that way? We are frozen, right, a little bit in trying to re-encapsulate the church's wisdom on these very important matters. Next slide. I'm not the only one that thinks this way. A famous professor you may have heard of, St. Thomas Aquinas, once said that we must love them both, those whose opinion we share and those whose opinion we reject, for both have labored in the search for truth, and both have helped us in the finding of it. Many people, I think, on the ground would not expect this to have been in the words of Aquinas himself, right? That says, listen, at the end of the day, you listen to both sides of the debate in order for you to come to a certain truth in your position. And so he says, do not throw out the counter-argument, in fact, absorb it into your thinking, so that all the more strong are the foundations of your ethics. Do you follow me? And let me tell you why this is important from a story that now I can't remember if I told. And I bet you will find everything. When I was 19, I was elected by my bishop to be head of faith education in my diocese. And I said, Monsignor, that's our bishop, Monsignor, you're making a grave mistake. And he said, Corey, two things. You do not tell your bishop that he is making a grave mistake. And secondly, there is a charism in you that perhaps you do not know and you will find someday. And I thought, oh, so lovely. So I put on my first day, interestingly enough, I was still studying for my undergraduate at the time in medicine. I had started off in medicine. And I remember my first day putting on my snazziest jogging suit with my loafers, fashion kind. I took my Bible, so I thought, if I'm working at the diocese, I guess I should carry that in. As well as a palette and a pencil, exceedingly technological. And I made my way into an office, the first time I was ever in an office in my life, as you can well imagine, and I sat down at my desk, not having a clue what exactly I was supposed to do. There was a meeting that afternoon, so I just thought I would wait. Sure enough, on that very first day, I received a phone call. And the call came in and said, and the woman on the other end said, is this Dr. Laverkertu? And I wasn't doctor, nor is my last name pronounced Laverkertu. But I had a feeling that she was looking for me. She said, are you the sacraments guy? For those of you who are Catholics, you'll appreciate the language here. Are you the sacraments guy? And I said, I am. And she said, do you do sacrament stuff? And I said, I do sacrament stuff. She said, well, I have a son who is now about ready to begin training for his first communion, and we want to get that done. And I said, well, I'm the person. And I said, what is the child's name? She said, well, I left the church several years ago. And I said, oh, that's unfortunate. What's the child's name? Because I did not want to know. I did not want to know. At 19, I wasn't sure what I was able to do. I was still using Velcro for my shoes and eating sand. And so she said, well, I'm going to tell you what happened to me. And several years prior, she had her firstborn child. And very unexpectedly, the child died hours after delivery. It was one of those very strange things, right? It was not detected, and sometimes this happens. And in her mourning, right, still in her hospital bed, somebody who she identified as a Catholic, and I didn't ask any details, somebody who she identified as a Catholic said to her, in so many words, how awful that in your mourning, your tradition teaches you that a child who dies without baptism does not do so well. And in her mourning, was she not struck, right, by this blanket statement that she received, information that she received from somebody she recognized perhaps as a Catholic? And as she wept on the phone, and I had no clue how to proceed, I did what the only thing I could do, was recite my catechism, right? And I said, well, I'm so sorry that this happened to you. But the only wisdom I can give you is that of my church. In Catechism 1261, there's one line that says, all children who die without baptism are submitted to the eternal mercy of God. And then she wept more. And for 10 minutes, I wasn't sure how to continue on the conversation, but I left her. And after that, she said, Joseph Johnson, right? That was the name of the chaplain. And interestingly enough, I was so taken by that experience that I went on to become an academic to make sure that I teach my students very well what the foundations of these things are so that they are well equipped when this kind of misinformation comes in that changes the trajectory of life, that women could have found great comfort in their community in the time of the morning, in a community that says children are still signals of God, right, the image of God, from the moment of conception, and yet that wisdom was bereft of her because of someone else who took upon themselves the illiteracy of the world around them. The church teaches this, when we start, we're a Latin time, right? So do know some Latin and take this home and pretend that you've learned a little bit. But it's Aquinas who says, I act according to who I am. So in the church, when you talk about ethics, the first thing you need to talk about before that is what exactly the church teaches about the person. Because the understanding is that you cannot know ethics in the church without knowing her anthropology. Does that make sense to you? Right? So you don't bother speaking about euthanasia, abortion, contraception, and so on and so forth until you have a good grasp of what we say about what a human person is from the beginning. So what is a person? I have to get to see what person is. The question was cracked open by the psalmist. Do you know this very famous and beautiful psalm, number 8? When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, there are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them. Yet you have made them a little lower than the angels or God, in your translation, and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the path of the seas. There were others, more ancient than we, who were trying to figure out this as well. Personhood and what it means to be a person is at the center of all ethics, if you ask my opinion. Every bioethical issue, every ethical issue in medicine, which is my field, it largely has to do with what a person might be. When we talk about aging, when we talk about abortion, when we talk about euthanasia, when we talk about contraception, personhood and what a person means with this particular tradition is so important that you can't possibly and responsibly start a conversation without making reference to it. In fact, as a good accord here, the church does very well in clarifying its concepts when it enters into public debate about some of these major issues. As of late, I was summoned by the bishops of Quebec who are now trying to figure out how Quebec will live within a society where physician-assisted suicide has been legalized. And the questions are, how do we have these types of conversations, for instance, with others? And I remember being interviewed about the Brittany Maynard case. Do you remember Brittany Maynard? She was very unfortunate, individual. She was in her late 20s, just got married, and had a terminal brain cancer diagnosis. It was like January 2014. She went for surgery, and by April 2014, she was found to be level 4, and she knew very well that with a 6-month prognosis, things were going to go downhill from there. And she said, you know what, I'm going to take my end into my own hands. And I remember her doing just that on November 1st, 2014. She ended it. And I was called immediately by a certain newspaper that said, we want you to comment, Catholic eyewitnesses, on this particular event. And I said, well, I know kind of what you want me to say and where you are going. The first question that came to me was, why is it that Catholics don't believe in death with dignity? That was the movement that Christians associated. And I said, you're sorely mistaken. Catholics are champions of death with dignity. We have a very different definition of what dignity is. And it's attached to the notion of personhood. Right? Very often you see these conflictual things, which I think stirs our young adult population as they try to maneuver their way through the wisdom of the church, that they see this kind of in front of them and then wonder how on earth are we supposed to deal with it. Dignity in the church is sealed by God's image, which is on all of us at all times. You never lose it, you never gain it. Right? It's all there, always. And because of that, this opens a whole other definition of what death with dignity might be. Do you follow me? This is something also that you'll see in contraception debates, in abortion debates, especially in abortion debates, and in euthanasia debates. In Catholic culture, what we notice is that in a lot of the secular debate around us, there is some hashing around these types of terminologies. How many of you would use human being, and this is not like a singularity, it's not, I don't know. How many of you would use human being and human person interchangeably? How many of you would clearly not use them interchangeably? The rest of you are undecided and that's a large fun. I want to hash this out with you because, again, very often in certain debates, right, about some of these major issues, the debates fall short because we haven't made certain things clear, and I want to make these clear today. Forgive me, I'm going to be academic with you, okay, but I'm only trying to give you some terminology. There are two terms that I hope that you leave with a little bit this evening, right? So the first one is called physicalism, and it means this. At the end of the day, let's make it really rudimentary. Physicalism says if you're a human being, you're a human person, period. There's no other kind of constituencies in there. If you're a human being, you're a human person. Is that okay? It's called physicalism. The flip side of that is something that's more popular in the world around us, which is called personalism. And personalism says if you do certain things, then you count. If you show certain properties and certain capacities, then you count. Does that make sense to you? I'm not asking you to agree with any of these, right? But personalism says that if you're able to think, if you're able to bear language, and so on and so forth, then you have moral status that we should protect. Otherwise, if you lose those things, dignity kind of sleeps with it. Is that okay? That's the mainstream understanding, I would say, of personhood. And because our debates forget this stuff, we often are very convoluted, right, when we're trying to talk to other people because we haven't made this clear. Let me show you a good example that I use with my students about personalism, right? That's the one that about function. An Episcopalian priest named Joseph Fletcher, who was one of the founders of bioethics, the study of ethical issues in medicine and healthcare, was a bit of a personalist. And he said this, listen, when it comes to persons, this is my definition, he said. Humans without some minimum of intelligence or mental capacity are not persons. No matter how many of their organs are active, no matter how spontaneous their living processes are, if the cerebrum is gone due to disease or accident and only the midbrain or brainstem is keeping autonomic functions going, they are only objects, not subjects. They are it, not that. Just because heart, lungs, and the neurological and vascular systems persist, we cannot say a person exists. Non-cerebral organisms are not persons. For somebody who is trying to think about, if you read his book, Humanhood, which is rather wonderful text, for somebody who is not really sure what the definition of personhood is, because that's where he starts the chapter, he says, I'm not really sure, but let me give you a few things. That seems quite confident to me, but forgive me if I misread this. Let's go through a few other criteria that he has here. He says these are the other things that you need. A minimum intelligence. He says any human whose IQ score is less than 40 on a standard Stanford Binet test is questionably a person, and IQ less than 20 is certainly not. If you're not sure, first of all, why this is 40 and not 43, where do these numbers come from? This test has cultural context behind it that are much worth our time. All of this is kind of questionable to be sure. If you're not sure if you do have an IQ less than 40 or more than 40, you really need to take an online test that always pop up on your screen when you're busy doing other things. And if you're a student writing a term paper, which I suspect some of you have done before, those are the times that you take the IQ test. I took one when it said, are you smarter than Einstein? And in my good arrogance, took the test for 6 hours and then had to really scramble to get the paper due. At the end, it tells you to get a visa number, right, to get this information. There's a whole there, so it's just not very fast. Self-awareness, self-control, to be in control of yourself, to be aware of yourself in time. A lot of these overlap. A sense of time and futurity, these are all connected, but understanding where I am in this time, this is 2015, I'm in this particular place, I'm this age, and I'm moving in this direction. A sense of past and memory. Most of my expertise, most of my area of study is in the area of aging and Alzheimer's disease, which is where I study very clearly because of my grandmother, who went through the process in her own time. If we have some time at the very end of today's meeting, my little talk here, I'll share with you a very important story that changed the trajectory of my life. But as a patient with Alzheimer's disease, this counted. Do you see that? She was no longer perhaps connected cognitively. And I say that with all witness to her past. Other things that you in there, concern for others, which is interesting. The capacity to relate to others, which is one of my favorites because I'm a recluse. If I had the choice, I would hide under a table in public settings like this. And yet, I find myself a very friend. That's what we're waiting for. The communication, isolated individuals, he says, are sub-persons. This is an interesting one. Your control over your existence, to be ignorant and helpless, is the antithesis of what it means to be human. Irresponsibility is sub-personal. To those of you who are procrastinators. Yeah. Curiosity, to be without affect, is to not be a person. Indifference, he says, is inhuman. You have to be open to both change and changeability. You have to shed a certain balance of rationality and feeling. That's one of my favorite ones. You have to be a unique identity in and of your own right, and he ties it all the way back to new force of consciousness. Do you see how this is a personalist definition of what it means? Do you see that? These are all functions, that if you don't meet your outcome, Catholics are not into that, just to let you know. Right? This is not the way that we do things. Not to discount this, because the world around you does really bind to this. Watch the abortion debates, watch the euthanasia debates, and so on and so forth. They largely contend on these things. Now, who decides which ones to keep in that list is up for grabs. Clearly, if Ford is writing the list, there are going to be costumes that I have, right? I think. And it gets a little bit more tricky. I remember asking a theorist, a colleague of mine, saying, wait, what happens to me when I'm sleeping? Because I seem to shed all of those capacities. And he said, oh, Ford, that's just a cog in the wheel. I'm like, So this is the real question, right? When it comes to personalism, and you see these types of definitions around him, and these great debates rise up, and Catholics are asked to contend and to act, to engage in that debate, the question is largely which characteristics are the ones that count. This is why it gets really tricky, and I think for good reason, and this is really fun, I think. Does anyone know who Santino is? Have you ever met this fellow? Oh, no. Santino is a chimpanzee who lives, he's about my age, so we get along. No, I don't remember. Lives at the Bergvik Zoo in Sweden. And there was some interesting tests that were done with him because they noticed that very early in the morning, the chimpanzee would wake up, go around his enclosure, eat, go with the same kind of routine, and then would sweep the grass or stones. He would take the stones and make a pile over here, and a pile over here, and a pile over here, and then go along his normal routine. At about 11 or so, when the zoo opened, if the visitors were aggravating, Santino would move to pile number 1. Right? And he would begin to toss as people screamed. I don't know how litigation works there, but and they would kind of watch this for a little while. And again, they didn't do this for a very long time because I think the zoo was suffering with passersby. But they watched this in good observation for some time. They removed all the stones from the enclosure. And the next morning, when Santino realized that there was nothing around for him to collect, he put his hand in the pond enclosure, you can see a little bit of it there, and would feel out for stone number 1, stone number 2, stone number 3, pile 1, pile 2, pile 3, and hurl, right, as this happened several hours later. Well, they removed those stones too. The chimpanzee the next day noticed that there were no stones anywhere, and still realized that these people were coming within a few hours. And so they watched as he walked along the enclosure of the tent, and where there was water trickling along the wall, he would smack it, and it would crumble, and pile number 1, and pile number 2, and pile number 3. That's called anticipated thinking, right? Which means you can wake up and say, oh gosh, I have a class today, or oh no, I'm going to work today, and my boss will be there, and so on and so forth. It's that understanding of you not being in the context yet, but knowing very well how you will feel. Do you follow me? That was considered to be one of these capacities that was only unique to humans for the longest time. So this personalism stuff is very interesting, but it gets exceedingly sticky and really fun when we engage animal ethics in particular. There's been a selective bestowal of personhood throughout all of our history. I want to impress this on you, right? The way that we have decided who counts and who doesn't count has been quite muddy since the beginning of our time. But even more recently, we can look at these selective bestowals of personhood. I'll read them out because I realize the screen is perhaps not clear as well. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1857 that black people were not persons in the Dred Scott v. Stanford case, and decided in the very famous 1973 Roe v. Wade case that unborn people were not persons. The law did recognize, however, at the same time, that entities such as corporations, partnerships, The collection of property could be considered persons entitled to the legal rights and protections that the Constitution afforded any white American male. Let me just tell you about Canada, because it's the only thing I really know. It was only in the last century, and I believe the 19th Amendment was passed here in 1919, 1920, which was not all that earlier to this. It was only in the last century that Canadian women were legally declared persons. The term up until then was synonymous with human male under the governing act of our country, thereby becoming eligible to appointment in the Senate. Beforehand, listen to this, beforehand, British common law claimed that women were persons in the matter of pains and penalties, but